King Cotton was once the herald ruler of the South, but following the Civil War, this king shouldered the blame for the South's losses. Many Southern leaders believed that their reliance on one crop had made them vulnerable to the Union's advances, and they pledged to diversify what they called the New South. Henry W. Grady, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, promoted the vision for the New South at a meeting of the New England Society of New York. Grady shared an optimistic view of the New South's potential, a strong core, economic diversity, and healthy growth over time. Grady and other intellects of his time foresaw an agricultural society based around the growth of several crops. They also saw the importance of following the North's example and turning towards industrialization. Proponents of the New South first turned to secondary crops that could thrive in Southern soil. Tobacco was the second most vital crop after cotton to pre-war South. Several factors led to a resurgence in tobacco production following the Civil War. Two new varieties, Brightleaf and Burley, were identified, and a new method for curing tobacco so that it had less bite was discovered. As the Union troops came south during the war, they were introduced to this tobacco, which opened up the new export market for Southern tobacco production. In addition, rice and Louisiana cane sugar became critical elements of the South's agricultural identity. This boom was due in a large part to an agriculturalist named Seaman A. Knapp. He moved to Louisiana and used the demonstration method of agriculture education to show farmers how to select the most appropriate crops for their soil and how to care for those crops. His educational exhibitions led the way to the development of a network of local and regional extension offices that supported agriculture, education, and production. However, Southerners were not willing to turn their backs on King Cotton completely, and that proved to be a wise move. With the textile industry beginning to boom and industrialization in full force, the number of cotton mills in the South increased from 161 to 400 after the Civil War. Partly as a cause of this boom and partly as a result, cotton consumption increased from 182,000 bales to 1,479,000 bales per year in the late 19th century. Cotton and other crops benefited from the ever-growing rail service. With additional rail lines crossing the country, both the North and South were able to profit from the other's productivity. Additionally, the advent of the refrigerated rail car allowed the other Southern produce to reach Northern markets, which further diversified the Southern economy. Field crops were not the only industry to take advantage of improved transportation. The area around Birmingham, Alabama became known for its iron, limestone, and coal production. Coal was especially important as an energy source for the trains that transported it. Between 1875 and 1900, Southern coal production increased by 44 million tons per year, from 5 million to 49 million tons. Another important energy source revitalized the South. Hydroelectricity, or electricity generated by water, was a growing force in the southeast region of the United States. This power source provided another important step in the industrialization process. The South also offered southern pine trees, which were in demand for their soft, multi-use lumber, which was used in great quantities to restore homes damaged during the war. Lumber camps grew exponentially in the South after 1870, and tree cutting rose to new heights. If not for the warm climate and quick renewal of the southern pines, the mass destruction of these trees might have rendered the South an ecological wasteland. Fortunately, scientific forestry grew alongside the lumber camps, and the first forestry school opened in Asheville, North Carolina in 1898. A host of other industries also developed in the South. The lumber industry carved the way for a bustling paper commerce. Clay, glass, and stone products were in high demand. Vegetables that were not sold fresh and transported on refrigerated railway cars were canned at one of several canneries in the South. And of course, the mint julep and moonshine reputation of the South extended a thriving beverage industry. Along with a changing economic profile, the political atmosphere was also being transformed in the New South. With the loss of the Confederate government, Southern residents turned to leaders within their community. These local leaders came to be known as Redeemers, both for their effort to redeem the South from being dominated by Yankees, as well as the redemption of the South from a one-crop society. Furthermore, the Redeemers' detractors pointed out a major truth about this group. Their true purpose was to undo the progress achieved by the Civil War and to reassert their dominance over blacks. Although as a group they did not participate in or advocate violence against blacks, as did the KKK, the Redeemers benefited from those kinds of aggression. Their main goals were to repress blacks at the expenses of whites and to increase their political power. The Redeemers also believed that education was important. but the cost should be borne by private benefactors rather than state governments. Most Southern states did not have government funds for public education prior to the Civil War, and after the war, the Redeemers felt that there were more pressing needs in the Reconstruction effort, such as business and industry. Several philanthropists did come through with the funds to keep the Southern education afloat. London banker George Peabody was a major supporter of education through his Peabody Fund, which provided over $3 million to public schools in the South. Another philanthropist, John F. Slater, donated another $1 million, which was designated for the development and maintenance of black schools. Democrats campaigned for congressional seats during the election of 1874 on the strength of programs such as Public Education Initiative and other Redeemer programs such as the Boards of Agriculture and Public Health. The public bought into the platform of the Redeemers, and with their votes, they gave the Democrats a majority in the House of Representatives, as well as several prime seats in the Senate. The changing mindset of the South allowed for several black politicians to emerge as leaders, if only of other blacks. South Carolina and Georgia both had black representatives in Congress throughout the late 19th century, although they had always represented areas with a high density of black residents. There was a tentative peace in the South between blacks and whites, but it had severe limitations. White Southerners expected blacks to keep to themselves, to socialize and worship in separate venues, to work for white people in menial jobs and for meager wages, and to never request or demand anything, including equal rights. Freedmen also encountered the difficulties of sharecropping, with little land available to purchase and few skills other than knowledge of how to work in the fields. Former slaves participated in a sharecropping system that provided a share of the crop for the worker's service. A similar practice was known as a crop liens, in which the owner of the land, usually a freedman or a poor white man, would offer a lien on his crop to a merchant in exchange for cash or supplies. Sharecropping and crop liens were idealistic plans used by crooked bookkeepers and white landowners who kept black men in perpetual debt. Since the 15th Amendment ensured that Redeemers could not outright disenfranchise blacks, they had to be crafty. Redeemers developed voting rules for their states that were known as literacy tests, although they were impossible tests meant solely to weed out black voters. In addition, the Redeemers implemented poll taxes that they knew many blacks could not afford to pay. While this did eliminate most of the black vote, it also kept many poor, uneducated whites from voicing their opinions at the polls. Still, the narrow-minded Redeemers considered this a victory for the South. The Redeemers felt further justified when Mississippi took their actions a few steps further. Under Mississippi's rules, voters also had to pass a literacy test and could not have been convicted of certain crimes. Again, these rules prohibited some poor white voters from participating in elections, although the rules were sometimes not enforced for the white constituency. Regardless, it was apparent to all that the harsh rules targeted blacks. The Mississippi Plan, as it came to be known, was adopted by 7 additional states over the next 20 years. Many of these states added their own exceptions that would qualify white voters who were kept from voting under Mississippi's rules. For example, South Carolina's literacy requirement had a loophole that exempted voters from this requirement if they owned $300 worth of property. Likewise, Louisiana invented the grandfather clause in 1898, which allowed illiterate voters to vote if their fathers or grandfathers had been eligible to vote on January 1, 1867. This excluded blacks since blacks did not have voting rights at the time. Exceptions like this were the norm as governments attempted to exclude only black voters without violating. The exclusionary attitude infused the South. A series of 7 cases before the Supreme Court ruled that discrimination against blacks by corporations or individuals was in violation of federal civil rights laws. However, the rulings did not prohibit. These segregation laws were first tested in a case known as Plessy v. Ferguson, which went before the Supreme Court in 1896. Homer Plessy was a man with 1/8 black ancestry who was ordered to leave the whites-only railroad car. He refused the order and was arrested and later convicted of this crime. He appealed the case all the way to the highest court, but the Supreme Court validated Plessy's conviction, and the Southern states took this as a green light to enact segregation laws on a wider scale. 2 black men, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, risked their lives to stand up against the violence and lead their fellow blacks, although in opposite directions. Washington, a former slave, had overcome the odds to receive an education at Hampton Institution, and he later built the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Washington encouraged blacks to keep to themselves and focus on the daily tasks of survival, rather than leading a grand uprising. He believed that building a stronger economic base was more critical at the time than planning an uprising or fighting for equal rights. Washington also stated in his famous Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895 that blacks had to accept segregation in the short term as they focused on economic gain to achieve political equality in the future. W. E. B. Du Bois, born after the Civil War and the first African American to earn a Harvard Ph.D., was one of Washington's harshest critics. He believed that Washington's pacifist plan would only perpetuate the second-class citizen mindset. Du Bois felt that immediate ceaseless agitation was only appropriate method for attaining equal rights, especially for those he dubbed the talented tenth of African Americans who deserved total equality immediately. As editor of the black publication The Crisis, Du Bois publicized his disdain for Washington and was instrumental in the creation of the Niagara Movement, which later evolved into the NAACP. Eventually, Du Bois grew weary of the slow pace of racial equality in the United States. He renounced his citizenship and moved to Ghana in 1961, where he died 2 years later. Both Washington and Du Bois had loyal followers, and both are legendary black leaders for the progress they made, even on different paths toward equality. Each served as important role models for later leaders of the civil rights movement.